Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight, we drift down the slow waters of the Han River, where the air before dawn carries both mist and the scent of wet earth. The town still sleeps, but the river is already awake, its surface rippled faintly by oars, its banks whispering with movement. There are no bells, no horns, no clamor of waking voices, only the quiet rhythm of wood against water and the distant call of a night bird fading into morning. The sky is pale grey, spreading along the eastern hills. From the small houses near the embankment, a few lamps flicker, darts of yellow trembling in the mist. The first fishermen move through the fog like shadows, their bamboo hats glistening with dew, their nets heavy and damp against their shoulders. One man, his hair tied with a simple cord, kneels at the edge of his narrow wooden boat, fingers testing the rope as though feeling the pulse of the river itself. He whispers a few words, not to anyone, but to the water, a morning greeting older than memory. Then, with one smooth motion, he casts the net. It blooms in the air like a pale, spreading wing before vanishing beneath the surface. Up the riverbank, a woman kneels beside a clay jar, scooping water with slow, deliberate movements. Her sleeves are rolled above the elbow, her reflection wavering in the shallow ripples. Behind her, faint through the haze, stands a row of huts, wood, clay, reed, their walls darkened by years of smoke and thin curl of smoke rises from one roof, carrying the smell of early fire and steamed millet. Inside, a child stirs, sitting upright on a woven mat, rubbing his eyes as his mother hums softly, folding his thin blanket away. The town itself wakes not all at once, but in small ripples, like water disturbed by a single drop. A door creaks open, footsteps cross a wooden floor, a rooster calls from somewhere unseen. Along the narrow street that leads toward the market, two men. Their stalls, one unrolling bolts of cloth, the other arranging baskets of dried fish. They speak in low tones, pausing now and then to glance toward the river, where light has begun to touch the water. At the edge of the main courtyard, the air thickens with the smell of boiling tea. A potter's apprentice sweeps the dust from the doorway, yawning as he works, while his master kneels near the kiln, testing the warmth with a practiced hand. In the next yard, two women carry bundles of silk thread, their bare feet soundless against the packed earth. They talk quietly, laughter rising once, soft as the sound of reeds in wind. The river, now touched by gold, reflects the first outlines of boats moving slowly through the mist. The fishermen call to one another, their voices deep and even, carrying across the still air. A boy sits on the pier, legs dangling above the water, watching the shapes glide past. He cups his hands around his mouth and answers one of the calls, a high echo. Laughter in reply. As the sun rises higher, the mist begins to thin, revealing the shape of the town. Wooden roofs huddled close together, a small bridge of stone spanning the narrowest part of the river, trees bending low near the bank. Ducks move lazily through the reeds, and the sound of chopping wood begins somewhere beyond the houses. The world is fully awake now, but without haste, without noise, every motion deliberate, unhurried, belonging to the steady rhythm of the river. From a distance, the air shimmers faintly above the water. The sound of the current is joined by voices, the ring of metal, the soft shuffle of sandals on clay. And still, beneath it all, the same pulse endures, the low hum of life beside the Han River, where morning begins not in thunder or bells, but in the small gestures of those who have always known its rhythm. As the sun lifted higher over the hills, the mist began to drift apart, revealing the full breadth of the Han River, a wide, gleamy ribbon that caught every glint of light like polished bronze. The air warmed slowly, though the dampness of dawn still clung to the ground and rooftops. The town had come alive now, not with sudden noise, but with a quiet, practiced order, as if each sound belonged to its own time and place. The clatter of wooden buckets, the low call of traders greeting one another, the soft splash of oars at the dock, all folded into a single steady rhythm, the rhythm of the day beginning in earnest. The embankment, a line of fishermen worked with calm precision. They moved barefoot upon wet boards, pulling their heavy nets from the river in slow, even motions. Silver-scaled fish flapped weakly against the woven fibers before falling still, their bodies catching sunlight like shards of glass. Each man worked without need for words. The gestures were old, learned from fathers and grandfathers before them. Behind them, boys darted from one boat to the next, carrying ropes, stacking, running errands for a few whispered coins. The river breeze carried the mingled scents of water, fish, smoke, and the faint sweetness of river reeds warmed by light. Farther inland, the market had begun to swell with people. Merchants unrolled bright bolts of silk dyed in vermilion and pale green. Women moved between stalls with small wicker baskets looped over their arms, pausing to examine herbs or earthenware jars filled with oil and salt. The sound of trade was soft, not the bargaining of distant cities, but the hum of familiarity, neighbors who knew one another's names and habits. Children wove through the crowd, their laughter light and quick, darting toward a man roasting chestnuts over a clay brazier, the scent of char and sweetness filling the air. In one corner, near the edge of the square, a weaver sat at her loom. The frame was simple, its wood worn smooth by years of touch. Her fingers moved with measured grace, guiding bright thread through darker warp. The rhythm of her hands matched the murmur of the crowd, a soft percussion that seemed to keep time with the day itself. Her daughter, no more than 6, sat cross-legged nearby, playing with scraps of silk that shimmered in the sunlight. When the child lifted her hand, the colors flashed, gold, blue, red, a small rainbow caught between fingers. Beyond the market, the potter's kiln was alive with heat. The master potter, a man with hair gray at the temples, crouched beside the opening, peering into its heart of flame. Rows of unfired vessels waited beside him, each one slightly different, though shaped by the same steady hand. His apprentice carried finished parts to a shaded table, setting them in neat lines where the glaze caught sunlight in faint glimmers. The smell of clay hung thick in the air, cool and mineral, mixed with the dry scent of smoke. Down by the river again, a group of boys had begun to play in the shallows. They chased small boats of folded paper, cheering one, caught the current and drifted away. An old man, sitting on a low stool, smiled at their noise. He dipped a fishing line into the water, his movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. Behind him, a row of ducks paddled near the reeds, their reflections wavering in the shifting light. By late morning, the sound of the town had grown fuller but never harsh. Hammers struck wood, a flute played somewhere faintly, its notes weaving above the murmur of conversation. Smoke rose from kitchen chimneys, carrying the smell of rice steaming in clay pots. From a high balcony, a scholar leaned over his scrolls, his brush tracing quiet lines of ink across pale paper. Below, his wife called to him, laughter in her voice, and he set the brush aside, smiling as he turned toward the light. The river, always near, flowed on with unbroken calm. Its current glimmered with the color of the sky, now pale gold, now a deeper blue. Reflections of boats, trees, and roofs trembled upon its movement, the fisherman's net, the potter's hands, the weaver's shuttle. There was the same quiet assurance, the same ancient patience. The Han River carried more than water. It carried time itself, flowing past 1,000 small gestures that together became the story of a day. By midday, the air over the Han River shimmered with heat, its surface a restless mirror broken by the slow drift of boats. The mist of dawn had long vanished, leaving behind a sky of pale, unwavering blue. Sunlight pooled across the rooftops of the town, catching on every clay tile and window frame, turning even the worn timbers gold. From the high slope where the temple stood, a faint bell sounded, one measured note carried over water and woven into the hum of daily life below. The riverbank was crowded now. Fishermen had returned with their morning catch, and the docks buzzed with quiet activity. Women crouched near the shore, sorting fish by size, their hands slick with water and scales that... In the sun, a young boy, barefoot and quick, carried baskets up toward the market, his shoulders straining beneath the weight but his grin unbroken. Nearby, two old men mended torn nets, their fingers working with slow precision, their talk a low murmur lost in the sound of lapping water. One paused to squint at the river, nodded once at something unseen, and returned to his work without a word. In the market, color ruled. Bright cloth hung from poles, fluttering softly in the breeze, fruit. And vegetables gleamed under the open sun. Oranges, gourds, beans, and greens stacked in neat mounds. A merchant selling ceramics poured water over his wares to make them shine, droplets running down the glazed surfaces like quicksilver. The air carried the smell of cooked rice, roasted chestnuts, and sweet buns filled with red bean paste. Children lingered near the food stalls, hands behind their backs, eyes wide, waiting for some small kindness. A scholar passed through the square. Tucked beneath his arm, his face half shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, he paused near a tea stall, exchanging a few words with the vendor before sitting on a low bench. Steam rose from the clay cup as he drank, eyes on the river in the distance. At another table nearby, two men played waiki, black and white stones clicking gently against the wooden board, their focus unbroken even as the bustle of the market swelled around them. In a shaded courtyard not far from the square, women worked at their looms. The sound of weaving filled the air, the soft thunk of wood, the whisper of thread pulled tight. Each movement was sure, unhurried, guided by rhythm and habit. A child slept nearby beneath the shade of a woven mat, one small hand curled loosely around a silk ribbon that glowed against her skin. From the wall above, wind chimes stirred faintly, their tones thin and pure as the air itself. The potter's kiln roared, its heat visible in the trembling air. Apprentices moved carefully, carrying fresh clay vessels toward the opening, their faces glistening with sweat. The master stood nearby, arms folded, watching the color of the flames. Each shade told him something, when to feed more wood, when to seal the mouth, when to wait. His eyes reflected the fire, but his mind was elsewhere, tracing the unseen form of the parts cooling behind him, each one a record of his patience. By the river's bend, women knelt washing vegetables, the green of their basque. Reflected in the shallows, a man steered a flat-bottomed barge past them, calling softly as he passed. They lifted their hands in greeting, the sound of their laughter following him downstream. Ducks darted between reeds, scattering ripples across the water, while dragonflies hovered and flicked away, their wings catching sunlight in flashes of blue and gold. As the afternoon deepened, the rhythm of the town slowed. The merchants leaned in the shade of their stalls, the fishermen rested near. The docks, their nets drying in the heat. Somewhere, a flute played a slow, wandering melody, not for audience, but for the air itself. The sound drifted across courtyards and rooftops, tangled with the scent of food and smoke, and vanished softly into the open sky. The Han River, constant and vast, flowed on without pause. Its surface gleamed beneath the sun, a liquid mirror carrying the shapes of boats, clouds, and people whose lives it had witnessed for centuries. Each wave that shore carried something unseen, the trace of laughter, the echo of tools, the soft hum of human life that had unfolded here quietly for generations beyond memory. By mid-afternoon, the light had softened, trading the glare of noon for a golden calm that settled over the rooftops and the river alike. The hum of the market had ebbed to a quieter pulse. Merchants reclined behind their stalls, fanning themselves with woven palm leaves, their earlier cries for customers replaced by low. Conversations and laughter carried lazily through the heat. The smell of tea and charred grain filled the air, mingling with the faint salt of drying fish. Along the riverbank, men repaired the long bamboo poles used for nets. They worked in pairs, one holding steady, the other tying fresh cord with nimble fingers. Between them lay the day's catch, fish glinting like scattered coins upon reed mats. Beside them, boys squatted in the dust, playing with smooth stones, tracing circles in the sand. That vanished with each movement of their hands. Now and then they paused to glance toward the boats gliding by, their sails pale as moth wings against the late sun. Across the street from the docks, a scribe sat cross-legged in the shadow of his doorway. A small wooden desk rested before him, its surface crowded with scrolls weighted by stones. The brush in his hand moved slowly, its tip whispering over paper as he copied a line of poetry he had heard that morning in the tea-house. He glimmered with reflected light, the black sheen turning to bronze with every tilt. The words he wrote were not his own, yet his hand lingered on them as though he knew their rhythm from within. When a gust of wind passed, lifting the corner of a scroll, he pressed it down gently, as one would calm a sleeping child. Farther inland, the sound of hammers echoed from the smithy. Sparks leapt each time metal met metal, bursting like fireflies before fading to smoke. The smith's apprentice pumped. Bellows in steady rhythm, his young face streaked with ash. The master stood bare-armed beside the anvil, his eyes narrow in the heat. Each blow was deliberate, each pause exact. A sword took shape there, not for war, but for ceremony, meant to hang untouched in a hall until time itself dulled its edge. Beyond the forges, the courtyards of homes lay drowsy and bright. A woman rinsed rice in a wide bowl, the water spilling in thin streams across her feet. A child helped her gather. Small hands clumsy but eager. From another doorway drifted the low hum of a song, wordless but steady, its melody winding upward like smoke. A pair of hens crossed the lane, their feathers catching sunlight in flashes of bronze and cream. The air was slow, as if every gesture, every sound, carried twice its weight in the thick warmth of the hour. Down by the river again, the boats had begun to gather toward the shallows. Some fishermen knelt, patching the seams of planks with resin. Others sat. Idle, their hands folded, eyes half closed, faces tilted toward the sun. A few traded jokes across the water, their voices soft, the humor in them born more from friendship than mirth. Behind them, the current glided past, slow and patient, carrying leaves and stray petals that drifted from the trees above. As shadows lengthened, the sky deepened into amber. The sound of flutes rose once more, this time from the far side of the town where a procession moved toward the small. Women carried lanterns still unlit, their silk sleeves stirring with the wind. Children followed, whispering questions they would forget before the night returned. The smell of incense reached even those working at the docks, faint but unmistakable, a thin thread of sweetness woven into the air. The day had not yet ended, but its tone had changed. The urgency of morning had faded, the stillness of evening waited at the horizon. The Han River shone softly, mirroring the slanting light, its ward. Marked with the shadows of boats and bridges and the slow, graceful passage of time. Every motion, every voice seemed part of that same current, one unbroken flow moving toward dusk, toward the quiet that would soon settle again over the town. The light began to lean toward evening, softening to amber, then to the deep ochre that wrapped the river and the rooftops alike. The heat of the day thinned. A breeze drifted down from the hills, cool enough to stir the hanging silks in the market store and carry the faint scent of water plants from the banks. The town had entered that quiet hour between labor and rest, when tools are set aside, fires are stoked again, and voices lower almost by instinct. Along the Han River, the fishermen prepared their boats for the next tide. The morning's nets were now washed and drying on wooden frames, the cords dark with dampness and heavy from use. Two men bent side by side, knotting new strands while speaking little, their rhythm sure. Identical. A small boy stood barefoot between them, tying rope around his wrist to practice, his laughter breaking the calm as his knot slipped loose again. One of the men smiled faintly but did not correct him. There was no need. The boy would learn, as he had, by repetition, by the slow and patient inheritance of gestures older than words. The market, once full of noise, had fallen to murmurs. The merchants had finished their trading, and most stalls stood half empty now, baskets. Over, goods covered in cloth. The few that remained open sold food, rice, vegetables, small skewers of roasted fish. Smoke drifted in soft spirals from the cooking fires, rising into the amber air before disappearing. Families gathered at low tables along the street, bowls of rice passed hand to hand, laughter quiet but frequent. Somewhere a storyteller recited verses beneath a tree, his voice low, the rhythm of his words flowing like the river itself. In a courtyard homes, a group of women rinsed dyed silk in wooden tubs. The cloth shimmered beneath the water, threads of scarlet, indigo, gold, the colors rippling with every motion. The women's sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, their arms pale and wet, the sound of washing joined by soft conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. A young girl stood beside them, holding a spindle almost her own height, turning it with care though her thread twisted unevenly. One of the women watched her for moments, smiling before reaching to correct the angle of her hand. The child's concentration deepened, her brow furrowing. The spindle warbled once, then steadied. At the far edge of town, a potter worked alone in the fading light. His kiln, now cool, stood silent beside him, its smoke long gone. Rows of pots cooled on the ground, some plain, some glazed, all still warm to the touch. He lifted one, turning it slowly in his hands, the smooth clay catching the low light in it. Movements were slow, deliberate, as though he measured time by touch. Behind him, the faint hum of cicadas began to rise, blending with the gentle hiss of wind through bamboo. Down by the riverbank, families bathed in the shallows. Children splashed water onto one another, their laughter echoing across the reeds. A man washed his face and arms, his reflection broken into ripples by each movement. Beside him, an older woman filled jars with water, her motions careful, practiced. Cooler, the river darkened from bronze to a deep, slow-moving blue. When the sun finally touched the horizon, the world shifted. Shadows lengthened across the terraces, roofs glowed faintly before fading into silhouette. The temple bell rang once, a long, low tone that lingered in the air long after the sound itself had gone. The first lanterns were lit, small circles of gold that flickered in windows, at doorways, along the riverside path. The town's voice changed with the light. Conversation softened, footsteps slowed. Smoke from the cooking fires mingled with the scent of jasmine carried from gardens near the water. The river reflected it all, lanterns, sky, faces leaning from balconies, each image trembling upon its surface before fading again into the flow. And through it all, the same quiet certainty endured. The Han River moved onward, unhurried, eternal, its waters carrying the memory of the day, of nets and songs, laughter and firelight, down toward the unseen sea, where night would gather all things into silence once more. The sun slipped below the hills, leaving behind a faint glow that lingered above the water like breath upon glass. The Han River turned from gold to copper, then to a dark, reflective ink that caught each flicker of lantern light from the town. The air had cooled, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, river reeds, and the faint sweetness of jasmine that drifted down from the higher terraces. The sounds of the day, hammer, flute, chatter, footsteps, had softened to murmurs, each one dimming into the quiet hum that marked the slow arrival of night. At the docks, the fishermen finished their work. Nets, still damp from the afternoon's patching, were folded carefully and stored beneath canvas. The boats bobbed gently in the current, ropes creaking against the wooden posts. One by one, lanterns were lit at the prows, small flames trembling in the evening breeze. A man tested the knots on his mooring then. Stood for a long moment looking out over the water. His reflection swayed beneath him, distorted but whole, carried downstream like an echo of himself. The market had emptied, though its traces remained. The scent of food still lingered in the air, smoke and soy, roasted chestnuts, grilled fish. Dogs prowled between the stalls, tails low, searching for scraps. A few merchants lingered, counting coins by the light of oil lamps, their faces golden against the dark. 2 old women. On low stools, their baskets empty, their voices low but cheerful. They spoke not of trade, but of weather, of the ripeness of melons, of who had fallen ill and who had recovered. When they finally rose to go, they walked slowly, leaning on each other's arms, their laughter soft as the rustle of cloth. In the houses facing the water, families gathered for the evening meal. The glow of hearth fires spilled onto the courtyards, flickering across bowls and woven mats. Steam rose from parts of it, and vegetables, the scent filling the narrow lanes. Children sat cross-legged beside their parents, voices quiet now, lulled by the rhythm of chopsticks against clay. Outside, neighbors called gentle good nights to one another across fences, their words drawn out and unhurried, more ritual than conversation. A musician sat alone at the edge of a small bridge, his back straight, his instrument resting across his knees. The melody he played was slow, unhurried, its notes clear but subtle. Drifting across the river until it was hard to tell where sound ended and the whisper of wind began. From nearby windows, people paused to listen, their movements stilled for a moment. A child resting on his mother's lap lifted his head, eyes wide, then smiled faintly before sleep reclaimed him. Up on the hill, the temple bell rang once more. The sound was softer now, carried by the wind rather than cutting through it, but still it reached every corner of the town. Monks moved through the courtyards in silence, lighting incense that released thin ribbons of smoke into the cooling air. The scent of sandalwood drifted downward, mingling with the smell of the river and firewood. As the last traces of sunlight vanished, the town transformed entirely. The outlines of rooftops merged with the darkness. The river became a single flowing mirror. Lanterns barbed upon its surface, tied to small boats or left to drift free, their reflections multiplying as they moved with the current. From the bridge, one could see them stretching in a wavering line across the water, each light a heartbeat carried toward the distance. By the doorways, people lingered. Some spoke softly, others simply watched the sky. Children leaned sleepily against their mothers, their eyes following the lanterns until they disappeared. The cicadas began their slow song, joined by the croak of frogs hidden among reeds. The town exhaled, its energy folding inward. Night settled fully, deep and still. The fires, the homes dimmed. One by one, the lanterns along the streets were extinguished. Only those upon the water remained, gliding away until their glow was no more than faint stars upon the river's surface. The Han River flowed on, carrying the day into darkness, its current unbroken, its song unchanged, steady as the passage of time itself. And in the hush that followed, the town beside it slept, the sound of water the last voice left awake. Night deepened across the Han River valley. Traces of lantern light fading until the town lay cloaked in near-complete darkness. Only a few scattered flames remained, the dull red of hearth coals behind paper screens, the faint gleam of a boatman's lamp swaying with the current. The air had cooled to stillness. Crickets whispered from the reeds, frogs called in long, deliberate intervals, and the water itself seemed to murmur, an endless voice too soft to name. Within the houses, families slept. The sounds of the day, the clatter of markets, the murmur of work, the cry of vendors, had been replaced by the even rhythm of breathing. Mothers slept curled around their children, cloaks drawn close, their hair loose against their faces. The faint smell of rice and firewood lingered in the air, softened now into memory. Outside, shoes rested neatly by the doors, their owners lost to dreams that flowed as slowly and unbroken as the river itself. Down by the docks, the last fishermen settled upon their boats. One man sat, cross-legged, a blanket wrapped over his shoulders, his gaze lost upon the black water. He did not fish now, he only listened. The river shifted faintly beneath the hull, its current deep and slow, brushing against the posts with a low sigh. Beyond him his companions slept, their shapes barely visible in the dim light of a single oil lamp. The air smelled of tar, rope, and wet wood. The quiet was so deep it seemed the earth itself had ceased to move. Along the narrow streets, the lantern burned to stubs. Paper panels drooped, blackened at the edges, the wax inside reduced to clear pools. Cats slipped between shadows, their paws soundless upon the worn stone. A stray dog lay curled beneath an empty stall, its ears twitching at every faraway sound. Somewhere, a door creaked softly as the wind moved through a gap, then stilled again. On the far hill, where the temple overlooked the river, monks moved through their final prayers of the night. The sound of the wooden gong carried faintly downward, a single slow rhythm, distant but clear. Candles flickered within the shrine, casting tall, thin shadows along the walls. The scent of sandalwood and ash drifted down through the cool air, mingling with the smell of water and reed. In the courtyards below, the night insects grew louder, their voices blending into one long, continuous tone. Bamboo rustled faintly in the wind, each leaf brushing another like whispering hands. Near the southern gate, two guards leaned against their spears, their conversation reduced to murmurs. One yawned, the other adjusted his cloak and looked up at the stars. The sky was heavy with them, bright, cold, innumerable. The Milky Way stretched across it like a great river mirroring the one below, its light trembling upon the water whenever the breeze stirred. The hours crept past unnoticed. The river continued its steady song, slipping through reeds and around rocks, touching the posts of moored boats before vanishing into darkness. Beyond sight, every now and then a faint splash broke the stillness, a fish leaping, a rope shifting, the whisper of life continuing even in rest. The sound did not disturb the peace. It completed it, as though the night itself needed a heartbeat to remain alive. And so the town slept. From the hilltop temple to the lowest dock, from the smallest hut to the merchant's wide courtyard, all lay bound in the same stillness. The fire of the day had burned out, leaving only quiet, warm, slow rhythm of endurance. Yet even in this silence, something gentle remained awake, the pulse beneath the stillness, the quiet awareness of a world that never truly stops. It lived in the flow of the river, in the sigh of wind through bamboo, in the faint glow of a single ember refusing to die. The Han River carried it all, the stories, the breath, the dreams of the sleeping town, down its endless path beneath the stars, toward the deepest hour of night when even the insects had grown silent and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. A faint mist began to gather once more along the Han River. It rose from the water in slow ribbons, curling around the moored boats and the legs of the docks, softening every shape it touched. The town re-emerged in silence, half visible, half lost to vapor, the world reduced to outlines and suggestion. Lanterns long extinguished left behind the faintest glow where their wicks still smoldered, ghostly points of warmth within the haze. At the temple, the hill, the monks extinguished their final candles. One remained kneeling by the open door, gazing down at the river far below. The night air moved through the chamber in gentle waves, carrying the scent of pine and incense ash. He whispered a final chant, not aloud but in rhythm with his breath, then bowed once to the unseen horizon before rising. His sandals touched the stone with no sound as he passed through the courtyard, the last flame of the shrine flickering behind him, dying. Wind closed the night around it. In the streets below, every home slept. The wooden shutters were closed. The dogs and chickens lay curled in corners, dreaming their small, unknowable dreams. Smoke, long since faded, left only its ghostly trace within the rafters. A single house near the river's edge still held a dim red ember in its hearth. Its glow reflected faintly in the polished rim of a clay pot beside it. Beside the fire, an old woman stirred in her sleep, her hand resty. Blanket, her lips moving in some quiet memory. Outside, the river whispered as though answering her. A thin breeze drifted through the reeds. Their stalks swayed in slow unison, their soft hiss the only voice left awake. The boats bobbed faintly on the water, ropes creaking at intervals, the wooden hulls knocking gently against one another. The sound was almost human, a sigh, a breath, a small complaint of restlessness within the calm. Somewhere downstream, a duck stirred and flapped its wings. Once before settling again, the ripples fading into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Above the mist, the stars continued their silent passage. The Milky Way, arched bright and dense, mirrored faintly in the river's surface. For a moment, it seemed as if the sky and water had joined, one reflecting the other, each holding within it the same slow, endless movement. The constellations of the Han astrologers, the dragon, the river of heaven, gleamed in their ancient order, indifferent. To sleep or waking, to the brief hours of human labor below. Inside the homes, the dreams of the villagers flowed in their own currents. Fishermen dreamed of deep waters and heavy nets, their bodies moving faintly beneath the blankets as though still working. The weavers saw threads of endless color, silk gliding between their fingers in patterns that shimmered and dissolved. The potter dreamed of clay that breathed, each vessel alive, whispering his name as it cooled. The children dreamed of the river, always the river, its glittering surface wide and endless, its sound merging with the rhythm of their hearts. The mist thickened until the village seemed to float above the world. Roofs faded into cloud, the distant hills dissolved. Even the temple on its high ridge became no more than a suggestion of shape. And still, the Han River moved, unseen but constant, its current deep and smooth, its waters carrying the memory of every life that had risen and slept upon its banks. Time the eastern sky began to pale, the first hint of dawn stirring beyond the mountains. The mist had woven itself so tightly around the town that nothing remained visible but sound. The faint dripping of water from the eaves, the far call of a bird unseen, the quiet pulse of the current below. The world waited, poised between darkness and light, one breath before waking, one heartbeat before another day began. And when the first thin line of gold broke the horizon, the town opened its eyes once more. Dawn arrived not in brightness, but in slow gradation, a pale bloom of light unfurling along the horizon. The mist that had settled through the night began to thin, folding back toward the water as the warmth of morning touched it. The first outlines of the town re-emerged, rooftops glistening with dew, clay pots lining the windowsills, the faint curls of smoke rising from rekindled hearths. The Han River shone faintly silver, its surface still veiled in that clung to the boats and reeds like threads of silk. A rooster called from somewhere deep within the lanes, its voice cutting through the hush like a signal. Dogs stirred. A door slid open with a long, wooden sigh. From within one house came the rhythmic sound of sweeping, straw against clay, steady and unhurried. The sound spread, picked up by others, until it became the morning's first chorus, a soft rustling that echoed down the narrow streets. The fishermen were the first to reach the docks. Their faces were marked with sleep, but their movements were sure. The same men who had drifted through the fog the night before now prepared their nets again, uncoiling rope, checking knots, their gestures slow and silent as ritual. One knelt beside the edge, rinsing his hands in the cold water before touching the boat's hull, a gesture of respect, perhaps, or habit so old its meaning had been forgotten. A boy stood beside him, barefoot, clutching a bundle of oars half his height, breath visible in the chill air. The man looked down, nodded once, and together they pushed the boat toward the shallows. The river accepted them without resistance. Its surface rippled, caught briefly by the oars before smoothing again. The mist parted as they moved, closing behind them in slow motion. Along the shore, other boats followed, a procession of dark shapes moving through the pale silver of morning. Their voices carried softly across the water, each one distinct but blending into tone as calm as the river itself. Up the hill, the temple bell rang, marking the first hour. Its sound rolled over the rooftops, down the streets, and out across the water, a single deep note that lingered like the tale of a dream. In response, the town began to wake in full. Smoke rose from chimneys, fire cracked softly in the hearths. The scent of boiling rice and green tea drifted from open doors. Women appeared in courtyards, their hair unbound as they fetched water or hung damp. Across bamboo poles, children followed them, still half asleep, rubbing their eyes with small fists. The day began again, as it always had, not with noise, but with rhythm. At the marketplace, merchants unrolled their mats. A man arranged baskets of beans and dried herbs. Another displayed his pottery, each bowl and jar catching the new light with faint, pearly reflections. A woman selling silk draped her bolts of cloth across the stall beams, colors spilling out, crimson, ind. She paused for a moment, the fabric trailing through her hands, then adjusted a fold that had caught the wind. The sound of voices returned, light and tentative at first, then stronger. By the time the sun crested the hills, the town was fully awake. The mist had lifted, revealing the river in all its breadth, calm, gleaming, immense. Reflections of boats and roofs shimmered upon its surface, each distorted by the smallest breath of current. The air was clear now, filled with the mingled scents of steam, smoke, and wet soil. In every courtyard and along every street, people moved in measured harmony, each motion repeating those of countless mornings before. And though the day had only just begun, it carried within it the echo of all others, the same cycle of work, rest, silence, and renewal. The Han River flowed beside it, constant and indifferent, its waters carrying away the remnants of yesterday even as it mirrored the birth of today. The sun climbed higher, vanished into the horizon. Children began to play along the bank. Somewhere in the distance, a flute began its song again, the same melody that had ended the previous day, now beginning anew. The air shimmered faintly with its sound, and beneath it, the town breathed, alive once more in the endless rhythm of the river. By mid-morning, the warmth of the sun had softened the cool breath of dawn, and the town beside the Han River glowed with that gentle brightness that belongs only to early day. The water shimmered like brushed metal, its surface restless but calm, catching light in constant motion. The air was filled with movement now, footsteps along the market lanes, the ring of wooden ladles on clay pots, the distant thud of a hammer from the smith's yard. And beneath it all, the deep hum of voices, the familiar rhythm of human life stirring into its full tempo. At the river's edge, the boats drifted farther from shore. The fishermen, now small against the wide current, stood, balanced upon their narrow decks, their figures framed by the pale sky. They worked in silence, the sound of nets falling and ropes drawn faint but steady. Each gesture was part of an old choreography, the dip, the cast, the pull. When one man hauled up a net heavy with silver fish, his laughter carried across the water, short, bright, and quickly swallowed by the wind. On the bank, his son waited barefoot, squinting into the light, a basket ready in his hands. He was too young to join, but he mimicked their motions in secret, casting invisible nets into the air, his shadow flickering against the sand. Up the slope from the docks, women knelt beside wide basins, washing vegetables pulled from the small plots behind their homes. The water was cool, clear, scented faintly of mint from the riverbank. Each motion sent ripples flashing in the sun. Beside them, chickens pecked through the damp soil. A toddler wandered near the edge, his steps uneven but determined, his mother's eye following him in that calm, unhurried way that comes from trust in the familiar. In the center of town, the market swelled. The same stalls stood as they always did: cloth, grain, tools, baskets of fruit, trays of clay cups stacked in careful towers, but their colors shifted with the hour. In the rising light, the silks shone like flame, the green of vegetables deepened. Even the plain wooden tables seemed burnished. A man selling tea poured from a pot blackened by years of use. Steam rose, vanished into the air, its scent mingling with the smoke of roasting nuts from the next stall. The buyers moved through slowly, not in haste to trade, but to greet, to speak, to inhabit the rhythm of morning before the heat arrived. Near the bridge, two scholars sat cross-legged on woven mats, a scroll unfurled between them. One traced characters upon the paper with the tip of a brush, his strokes deliberate and sure. The other watched, his fingers moving faintly as if to remember the shape of each word. The air around them smelled of ink and bamboo and tea. A boy stood nearby, holding the ink stone, wide-eyed at the sight of their work. When they paused to sip from their cups, one of them handed him the brush. The boy hesitated, then knelt and drew a line, crooked but earnest. The scholar nodded once, smiling, and the boy's face brightened like glass catching light. Farther down, where the road bent toward the fields, the sound of flutes rose above the hum. A group of young men, together, each carrying baskets of grain balanced on poles across their shoulders. They laughed as they walked, their shadows long and sharp against the dust. At their passing, the air stirred with the smell of straw and sun-warmed earth. Back by the river, the first boats returned. The nets, now emptied, hung from poles to dry, their damp cords shimmering faintly. The fishermen's wives came down from their houses, wiping hands on aprons, waving in quiet greeting. The catch was modest, but enough, as it always was. They spoke little. Words were unnecessary between those who had lived the same pattern since childhood. The men lifted the baskets from their boats and set them down gently, the fish flashing silver in the light before going still. The town had entered its full pulse. The heat of the day gathered above the roofs, pressing softly upon the streets, and yet there was no sense of weariness. Each movement, each sound, each pause seemed to belong to a greater rhythm, one that neither began nor ended but continued, unbroken, like the river itself. The people of the Han River lived not in haste but in flow, their hours bound to the slow breathing of water and wind. And as the sun rose higher, bright and steady above the valley, its light fell upon the river like a long memory, ancient, patient, and endless. By early afternoon, the sunlight had grown thick and golden, its warmth pressing down through the haze that shimmered above the rooftops. The Han River glowed. Lit from within, its surface dazzling where the current struck the rocks and drifted past the posts of the moored boats. The town lay wrapped in brightness, its colors softened but deep. The wood of the docks warm as honey, the clay walls flushed with heat, the fabric awnings of the market bleached pale by the day's long glare. The rhythm of life slowed to meet the hour. The fishermen had returned to shade. The merchants leaned drowsily behind their stalls. Even the dogs slept in doorways, tongues lolling, their bodies rising and falling in time with the faint hum of insects that filled the still air. The people of the river town did not resist the heat. They folded themselves into it, moved more slowly, spoke more softly, waited for the sun to tilt and the shadows to grow. In one narrow lane, a woman sat spinning thread beside an open window, her hands moving in patient repetition. The spindle rolled between her fingers with a faint whirring sound, catching glints of sunlight. It turned. Across from her, her mother rested in silence, mending a child's shirt with small, precise stitches. Between them hung a calm so deep that the sound of a passing bee seemed loud. From outside drifted the faint scent of boiled rice and river mint, the ordinary fragrance of noon. Down by the docks, the children had gathered beneath the bridge where the shade was cool and the air moved freely. They knelt in the shallows, making boats from reeds and scraps of bark, sending them out. The slow current. Each time one drifted too far, a shout went up. Each time it tipped and sank, laughter followed. A few older boys lay stretched upon the river stones, their heads resting on their folded arms, eyes half closed against the brightness. Above them the world shimmered, a single vast mirror of water and light. Beyond the town, the terraced fields rippled faintly under the sun. Farmers moved like shadows between the rows, their broad hats glinting, their motions slow, but the sound of water running through the irrigation channels was constant, a low, liquid murmur that merged with the wind. Now and then, a breeze carried with it the smell of damp soil and young rice, a smell so rich it seemed alive. At the marketplace, the few stalls that remained open sold food to travelers passing through. A tea seller poured steaming cups from a clay pot set upon glowing coals. The sharp scent of green leaves rose into the air. Nearby, a man roasted chestnuts. Turn. Carefully with a stick, the shells cracking softly as they browned. Those who came to rest sat cross-legged in the shade, cups held between their palms, eyes lowered, their conversation slow and quiet. A group of children arrived, their cheeks flushed, carrying bundles of lotus stems gathered from the shallows. They spread them out upon the stones to dry, laughing when the wind tried to steal the leaves away. The air was filled with their chatter, and for a time the stillness of noon was broken, alive again, but gently, like ripples touching the river's edge. Farther up the hill, the temple lay half in shadow. The monks moved through their midday rituals, sweeping the courtyards, filling bowls with rice for the poor who waited at the gates. Their robes stirred faintly in the heat, their bare feet silent upon the stone. From within the main hall came the steady rhythm of chanting. Low, deep, unhurried, the sound like a single voice breathing. The town below seemed to rest apart. That sound, its pulse slowed further, matching the measured cadence of prayer. The breeze shifted, the smell of incense drifted downward, blending with the scent of river mud and the dry sweetness of grass. By the time the monks' voices faded, the light had begun to change. Shadows lengthened along the narrow streets. The brightness of the water deepened to a softer gold. A heron stood motionless near the reeds, its reflection clear and still. From somewhere beyond the hill came the cry of a hawk, distant but distinct. The air had cooled just enough for the world to stir again. And so, as the day turned toward evening, the people of the river town began to move once more. The fishermen walked toward their boats. The potter opened his kiln. The merchants lifted the covers from their goods. The children gathered their small reed boats and baskets of lotus, running homeward with laughter echoing off the stone. The Han River, unchanged and unending, caught the light in a long trembling line, its surface golden at the center and blue at the edges, flowing steadily past the town that lived by its rhythm. It would carry this hour away, as it carried all things, quietly, patiently, forever. As the afternoon bent toward dusk, the heat began to loosen its hold on the town. The air, still warm but softened, moved gently through the narrow lanes, carrying with it the mixed scents of river water, smoke, and the faint sweetness of chestnuts roasting near the market. The brightness of the day retreated in slow degrees. Shadows returned first to the courtyards, then to the walls, then to the tiled rooftops, until the town was divided between light and cool shade. The fishermen had taken once more to the water. Their boats, now lighter and stripped of the heavy nets from morning, glided across the broad, calm surface of the Han River. Each stroke of the oar was measured, unhurried. The splash of water echoed briefly, then vanished. From above the bridge they looked like Drifting brushstrokes painted upon the fading gold of the current. The river, reflecting the lowering sun, shone like a sheet of beaten copper. A few egrets flew low over the reeds, their wings trailing soft ripples behind them. At the docks, the women had gathered again to clean fish and prepare supper. The rhythm of their knives was even and quick, the movements so practiced they needed no thought. They spoke quietly, laughter threading through their words. Behind them, small fires burned. Beneath clay pots, the smell of steam, salt, and oil rose into the cooling air. Children hovered nearby, drawn by the scent, pretending to help while stealing glances toward the food. Their mothers tolerated it, smiling without looking up. In the heart of the town, the market was folding in upon itself. Merchants tied cloth around their wares, packed baskets, counted the day's small earnings. The few who remained behind sold tea to the last passers-by, travelers on their way to them. Farmers heading home from the fields, the chatter of bargaining had ceased. What remained were soft exchanges, familiar and brief. A young man carried a bundle of reeds over his shoulder, humming under his breath as he walked. The notes were clear, low, wandering, absorbed into the evening air before they could fade completely. The potter sat before his kiln, its mouth glowing faintly orange as the last of the day's fire ebbed. The air around him shimmered with heat. He lifted one cooled bowl from the stack, turning it in his hands. Its glaze had set into a pattern of pale blue veins, like the branching of rivers. He smiled faintly, his face lined with the residue of soot and satisfaction, then placed the bowl beside the others in a neat row. A breeze moved through the workshop, stirring ash from the floor. The sound it made was like paper brushed by fingertips. At the edge of town, where the land sloped down to the water, a group of farmers led their oxen through the shallows, washing dust from their legs. The animals stood patient, tails flicking at flies, the reflection of the red sun caught in their dark eyes. Nearby, children threw stones that skipped 3 or 4 times before sinking. Each small splash caught the orange of the sky and then disappeared into blue. The temple bell sounded once more. Its tone was lower now, drawn out, vibrating through the air until even the river seemed to listen. Smoke from the incense bowls drifted down from the hill, curling into the streets. The monks' voices followed, low, continuous, almost inaudible at first, then gathering into a soft harmony that filled the valley. The people did not stop to listen, but they did not ignore it either. The chant was part of the hour, as natural as the scent of smoke or the ripple of water against the stones. As the sun finally met the horizon, the entire town glowed with its reflected light. The rooftops shone with a last, trembling brightness, the faces of the people. Burnished gold. On the river, the boats drifted like dark leaves carried upon fire. The air smelled of grain, oil, and earth, the scent of evening meals, of rest, of the day closing its hands around itself. One by one, the lamps were lit. Their small flames pushed back the gathering dark, glowing softly in windows at doorways along the water's edge. The Han River caught them all, doubled them, carried them onward. Each reflection trembled as the current moved, merging and parting in pat. That would never repeat, and so the town descended once more into the rhythm that was its life, day folding into night, sound into silence, motion into stillness. The people ate, spoke, laughed. The river listened. When the first stars appeared above the hills, their light met the lanterns below, and for a brief hour, sky and water mirrored each other perfectly, each filled with the same soft, flickering light of human persistence. The last of the sunlight withdrew from the hills, leaving only a long band of orange at the edge of the world. The Han River absorbed it entirely, turning from copper to a deep, viscous red that darkened with every heartbeat. The town below the temple grew quiet again, not from sleep yet, but from the collective slowing that came before it. People moved through the streets with softer steps, their voices carried in short exchanges that rose and faded like wind among reeds. At the riverbank, women bent over their wash basins, wringing out the fine. The cloth caught the dim light, flashing like wet silk before they folded it against their arms. A child helped one of them gather reeds from the shallows, his small hands trembling in the cool water. Each time he lifted a handful, droplets fell through his fingers like scattered beads. Behind them, the first evening fires began to glow in the courtyards, their smoke curling slowly upward, grey against the deepening blue of the sky. The fishermen were returning. Their silhouettes appeared first as shadows against the horizon, low, steady, one behind another, until the details resolved. The glint of wet bamboo poles, the faint flicker of lanterns tied to bows, the soft call of oars dipping into the water. The men spoke little. The sound of their boats brushing against the docks, the creak of rope, and the dull slap of water against wood formed their own kind of language. From the bank, their families waited with baskets in quiet patience. The fish, silver and small, glimmered like coins as they were poured from net to mat, the catch modest but sufficient. In the market square, vendors packed their goods in near darkness, their hands quick despite the failing light. One man lit a lantern, its yellow flame revealing the polished surfaces of the day's unsold parts. He ran his fingers along the rim of one, tapping it lightly. The sound, a clear, delicate ring, echoed through the nearly empty square. Somewhere a dog barked once, then lay down again. The smell of cooling oil and burnt grain lingered in the air. Up the hill, at the edge of the temple gardens, the monks had gathered for evening prayer. Candles burned along the inner wall of the shrine, their flames flickering in the breath of the night. The bell was struck 3 times, the sound carrying over the roofs of the town, through the mist that had begun to rise once more from the river. Each note dissolved slowly into silence, as though the mountain itself were breathing. Below, in the streets, people finished their suppers. Clay bowls were washed and stacked, fires were fed a last handful of wood. The older men sat together near doorways, sipping weak tea, their talk low and fragmented, half words, half memories. Children, not yet ready for sleep, chased one another through the lanes, their laughter sharp and brief, fading quickly into the dusk. A mother called out. The sound of sandals against stone followed, then quiet. The river widened into darkness, its surface, once gleaming, with sunlight, was now a mirror of fire and shadow, the reflected lanterns trembling in endless motion. The current carried them downstream, where they merged into a long, wavering trail of gold. A single boat remained on the water, drifting with no direction but the current's will. The man within it lay back, his hands crossed upon his chest, eyes open to the stars just beginning to show. Above him, the Milky Way arched faint and pale, a second river flowing through the sky. The town to dim, windows shuttered one by one, the voices dwindled until they were gone. The dogs curled beside the thresholds, their breathing slow, their ears twitching at the soft sounds of night, the whisper of reeds, the brush of wind against paper screens. The crickets began their patient chorus, filling the silence with rhythm. And when full darkness finally took hold, it was absolute. The Han River became invisible save for the scattered reflections of its lanterns. The mountains turned to silhouettes. The air itself seemed thicker, carrying the scent of smoke and water, of heat retreating and coolness rising in its place. Then, from somewhere unseen, a flute began to play, a slow, drifting melody that rose and fell without beginning or end. It wound through the streets, over the river, around the temple, until it was impossible to say where it came from. Its sound was neither joyful nor sad. It was the sound of the hour itself, of the day fading into the memory of all other day. The river flowed on beneath it, unbroken, eternal, whispering to the sleeping town that everything moved, everything returned, everything endured. The night ripened slowly, its darkness deep and full, wrapping itself around the town like heavy silk. The heat of day was gone, replaced by the cool, damp breath of the river. Mist gathered again along the water, thickening until even the closest boats were only faint shapes, their lanterns smudged into trembling orbs of gold. The Han River itself was now only a sound, the slow, patient murmur of water turning against stone, the soft lap of current beneath wooden hulls. Within the town, all was quiet. A few lamps still burned behind paper shutters, their glow so faint it seemed not to illuminate, but to remember. In one house near the docks, an old potter sat alone beside the dying embers of his hearth. He had worked until the last of the light had vanished, unwilling to leave the warmth that glowed faintly in the clay. Final vessel rested on the table before him, its glaze still soft. He traced his finger along its rim, feeling the heat that lingered there, the ghost of fire. Beyond the open door, the sound of the river pressed close, steady and constant, the only voice in the stillness. Across the street, a woman rose from her bed and crossed the courtyard, her feet bare against the cool stones. She looked upward. The stars were visible now, clear and endless, mirrored faintly in the dark sheen of them. Below, her child, asleep within, murmured softly in his dreams. She lingered for a long while, her hands resting on the wooden frame of the gate, listening to the faint whisper of bamboo stirring in the night wind. When she turned back toward the house, she paused at the threshold, as though reluctant to break the silence by stepping inside. The fishermen who had returned before sunset now slept in their boats, their bodies wrapped in woven mats. Their faces were lined but peaceful, their breaths deep and untroubled. The water rocked them gently. Each movement of the current met with the slow creak of rope against wood. Now and then, one stirred, half-waking, murmuring a word that belonged to the day, a name, a number, an unfinished thought before falling again into the rhythm of dreams. The river held them as surely as it carried their boats, as if both man and craft were part of its slow, unending drift. Farther inland, where the streets narrowed into silence, the dogs kept quiet watch. Their eyes caught what little light remained, faint glints like embers. Somewhere near the market, a jar was knocked over, the sound small but sharp in the stillness. Then all was calm again. The air was thick with the mingled smells of clay, wood smoke, and water, each softened by night into something formless, familiar, almost tender. The temple above the town glowed faintly in the dark. A handful of candles burned in the shrine, their flames bending toward the open doors where the wind passed through. A monk sat alone before them, cross-legged, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes were closed, but his posture was alert, steady, anchored. He breathed slowly, matching the rhythm of the river below. When he finally opened his eyes, the candles had burned low, their light reduced to the faintest shimmer upon the stone. He rose, stepped outside, and stood at the edge of the terrace overlooking the valley. The river below was invisible now, yet its voice filled the night, endless, ancient, patient. The stars above seemed impossibly near. Their reflections trembled faintly in the shifting mist, creating the illusion of two skies, one above, one below, with the town suspended between them. A shooting star crossed the heavens, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. The monk watched without reaction, his gaze unfocused, as if he were seeing not the moment but its echo. Down in the village, the last fires died. Smoke coiled upward in thin ribbons. Vanishing into the night, the air grew colder, settling around the sleeping houses. The sound of frogs began again from the reeds, joined by the whispering rustle of water grass. In one of the courtyards, a single paper lantern remained lit, its flame trembling each time the wind passed. Beneath its light, a young scholar sat reading. The scroll in his hands shimmered faintly with the ink of half-finished lines. He read without moving his lips, the words like silent prayer. Every so often, dipped his brush, added a character, then stopped, as though the act of writing itself might disturb the stillness. When the lantern's flame flickered low, he set the scroll aside and simply watched the light fade. Time passed without measure. The moon climbed above the mountains, round and white, its reflection stretching across the river like a bridge of silver. The mist began to thin once more, revealing the outlines of the boats, the quiet curve of the embankment, the roofs of houses. Touched by soft light, the town, which by day pulsed with labor and speech, now appeared weightless, suspended in calm, every sound reduced to its essence, the brush of air, the sigh of water, the pulse of crickets beyond the walls. And beneath it all, steady and unbroken, the river flowed. It carried the silence forward, mingled with memory, weaving it into the eternal rhythm of water meeting stone, of moonlight touching roofs, of the human breath that rises and falls through every age. Somewhere far downstream, the faint glimmer of the fishermen's lanterns moved on, tiny points of light floating through the darkness, the last visible trace of life before the night swallowed everything once more. Toward the far edge of night, when the moon stood highest and the air had turned cool enough to taste of metal, the town beside the Han River seemed to dissolve into its surroundings. Nothing moved except the mist drifting low across the water and the occasional tremor of leaves as wind slipped down from the hills. The world was not silent, but the sounds it made were so constant, so even, that they formed no pattern, only continuity. The murmur of the current, the creak of wooden beams, the faint ring of a bell struck by accident as the wind passed through the temple's courtyard. The river was brighter than the sky now. The moonlight, scattered across its surface, made it glow with a dim silver that pulsed whenever the current shifted. The fishermen's boats floated fragments of shadow against it, their hulls barely visible, their mooring ropes drawn taut with the pull of the tide. Lanterns still burned at the prows, small, dim, trembling things that seemed less like light than memory itself. In the upper quarter of the town, the scholar who had sat by his lantern earlier now slept, his head resting on his arm, his scrolls spread before him in disarray. The faint scent of ink still lingered. Beside him, the stub of a candle had guttered out, leaving a thin curl of smoke that wove upward until it vanished. His dreams were full of rivers, though not this one. He dreamed of the river from the poems he copied, the imagined waters of long-dead poets, broad and endless, flowing toward the horizon of their thoughts. The hand beneath him murmured its own verse, lower, truer, without words. Across the lane, an old couple slept upon a woven mat. Their breathing matched the rhythm of each other's, shallow but steady. On the wall above them hung a strip of cloth painted with a single character, peace. The ink had faded long ago, but the gesture of its brushstroke remained visible, strong, unbroken, like a pulse. The woman stirred once, murmured her husband's name, and fell still again. Outside, the shadow of a passing cloud moved across their door like a slow exhalation. At the docks, the water had begun to rise. The river's tide, reversing, filled the hollow spaces between boats and piers, lifting everything an inch higher with each breath. The wooden boards, swollen with moisture, released the faint scent of resin and salt. A single dog lay curled upon a pile of nets, eyes half open, watching nothing. The light of the moon caught its fur, turning it silver. Somewhere far downriver, a fish leapt, a sudden, perfect sound that rippled outward, then was gone. The temple stood as it had for centuries, stone unmoved by time. Its bell, dark and cold, gleamed faintly where the moonlight touched its rim. Beneath it, the monks, their cells, their sandals lined neatly along the wall, their heads shaved smooth and pale against their bedding. Only one remained awake, kneeling before the altar. His lips moved in prayer, though no sound emerged. When at last he bowed forward, his hands pressed to the floor, the gesture was not of ritual but of exhaustion, the surrender not to faith, but to stillness. From above, the whole town seemed like a model carved in shadow. The narrow alleys, the low roofs, the thin trails of smoke from dying fires, all were flattened into silence, arranged around the river's gleaming curve. Even the distant fields were still, their wet furrows reflecting the same cold light. The air was so clear that the stars seemed nearer than the trees. Hours passed unnoticed. The moon tilted westward, its reflection drifting with it, until the river lost its silver and turned to pale gray. The mountains began to separate from the darkness, first as shapes, then as masses of stone, then as the familiar ridges that defined the valley. A faint rustle moved through the reeds, the first stirring of birds unseen. Somewhere, a rooster crowed once, uncertain, as though testing the edge of dawn. The air changed. The cold that had held the night began to lift, replaced by a faint warmth that moved across the water like breath. Mist began to gather again, rising from the river in slow, curling threads that caught the first hint of light. The sky above the mountains paled to the color of rice. Paper, and then the smallest shift, a spark of gold at the edge of the horizon. The light widened, brightened, filled the space between earth and water until the first beam struck the river and broke into 1,000 points of fire. The night's weight began to fall away. In the town, a door opened. Another followed. From one roof to the next, the smoke of rekindled fires began to rise. The first human voices of the new day, faint, fragmented, half whispers, mingled with the returning of the river. Once again, the hand flowed through both worlds, the one that slept and the one that woke, carrying the past and the present in a single unbroken current, shining now with the light of beginning. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the valley, touching the rooftops, the courtyards, the quiet slope of the riverbank. The hand shimmered faintly in the morning mist, silver turning to gold, the reflection of the sky trembling upon its surface like breath upon glass. The town stirred not with haste, but with that deep, patient rhythm that had marked every morning before it. The sound of sweeping returned. The crackle of new fires broke the silence. The faint ring of a ladle against clay signaled the first meal of the day. By the docks, the fishermen rose one by one from their boats, stretching their limbs, blinking into the brightness. Their faces were lined by years of wind and water, but they smiled as they worked, the quiet contentment of men whose lives followed the same faithful pattern. They moved slowly, repairing the ropes, lifting the nets that had dried through the night. One man paused to watch the current, his eyes reflecting the glimmering light. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The day ahead was already written, as surely as the flow of the river. Farther up the embankment, the market awoke again. Merchants rolled up the cloth that had protected their stalls through the night, the scent of new wood and straw rising with the morning air. Women arranged vegetables in neat rows, their baskets glistening with dew. A child laughed, chasing a chicken across the narrow lane, his mother scolding soft and indulgent. From the bakery came the smell of steamed buns. From the tea house, the first wisp of fragrant vapor curling into the air. The potter who had slept beside his kiln stood now in the open courtyard. His latest bowls, cooled through the night, glowed faintly in the new light, soft blues and whites that mirrored the river beyond. He ran his hand along their edges, feeling the smoothness beneath his calloused palm, and then lifted one toward the sky as though offering it back to the sun. From the temple above the town came the sound of the morning bell, one deep, solemn note that rolled across the water and down the streets, gathering the world together for a moment before fading. The monks, stepping into the chill air, bowed toward the river as they always did, their robes fluttering lightly. In the wind, below them, the people of the town paused just for an instant to listen. The sound settled into their bones like breath, familiar, grounding, whole. By the river's edge, the children who had played there the evening before now squatted beside the shallows, tossing pebbles into the clear water. Each stone disappeared with a small, perfect circle of ripples that widened and vanished. The smallest boy leaned too far and nearly fell. His sister caught him by the sleeve, laughing. Behind them, an old man crossed the bridge, leaning on a stick, his pace unhurried. He stopped halfway to look downstream at the light, at the mist, at the unbroken surface of the water, and then continued on, vanishing into the brightness. The mist lifted. The river widened in the full light of morning. Boats began to move again, the splash of oars soft but sure, each one cutting a line through the reflected sky. The sound of work, of living, returned in harmony, the chatter of market. Voices, the thud of grain being ground, the cry of birds wheeling above the rooftops. And as the day unfolded, the town fell once more into its familiar rhythm, a rhythm older than memory, unbroken by time. The Han River flowed beside it, its waters glimmering, eternal, bearing upon its surface the echo of every gesture, every word, every silence. The same river that had held the night now carried the day. Its current whispered against the stones, promising return, promising contin. Life began again, not different, not new, but enduring, whole, and beautifully ordinary. And so the town of the Han River lived on, breathing, moving, shining quietly beneath the same sun that had risen for 1,000 years.